Hello and welcome. Today we are doing more notable names in African American history. Today we are looking at the first Supreme Court Justice of African American heritage, and that is Thurgood Marshall. The man is extremely important, not just because of the fact that he was the first African American on the Supreme Court, but all he did well. So, yeah. But he was born on July the 2nd, 1908, in Baltimore, Maryland, to William Canfield Marshall, who was a railroad porter and steward, and Norma Williams Marshall, an elementary school teacher. So, yeah. He would end up going to Lincoln University, graduating with honors, would be rejected from the University of Maryland because he was not white, and end up attending Howard University Law School, which I believe Howard University is one of the foremost African American black historical college universities in the nation. So yeah, historically black university, founded in 1867 in Washington D.C. Okay, now Thurgood Marshall, he would graduate and serve as a lawyer. In fact, he was a damn good lawyer. He had victories in cases like Murray versus Pearson, 1935, which accused the University of Maryland of violating the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection of the laws by denying an African American applicant admission on its law school solely on the basis of race. So he would win as the prosecuting lawyer filing against the University of Maryland. He would become an NAACP, lawyer in Houston in 1936. Now, during this time in the 40s and 50s, he would really come into his own as a top lawyer. He would win 29 of 32 cases in the Supreme Court. And among these cases, which the court ruled with him on, was a southern state's right of exclusion of African American voters from primary elections, Smith versus Allwright, 1944. So the court said, you can't, the state can't do that. No. We done had amendments added to the Constitution, says, nope, you cannot do that. State judicial enforcement of racial restrictive covenants in housing, Shelley versus Kramer, in 1948. So again, you cannot prevent people from housing because of their race. And separate but equal facilities for African American professionals and graduate students in state universities, under the case Sweat versus Painter and McLaurin versus the Oklahoma State Regents, both of which were taken in 1950. So he played big roles in them, but there is no confusion as what was perhaps his best case win. before the actual Supreme Court. 19, I think it was 54, we had the famous lawsuit, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. Yeah, it said they have the right. It basically integrated schools. So, just as a lawyer, Thurgood Marshall made huge leaps. Now, in September of 1961, Marshall would be nominated to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit Court by President Kennedy. His opposition from Southern senators did delay his confirmation by several months. President JBL, though, LBJ, sorry. I'm thinking of the wrestler. LBJ named Thurgood Marshall, U.S. Solicitor General in July 1965 and nominated him to the U.S. Supreme Court on June the 13th, 1967. And his nomination would be confirmed 69-11 in at August 30th, 1967. So it took half of June, all of July, and pretty much all of August to be confirmed, but he would be. And even though we see how good he was as a lawyer to make, meaningful change, he would do a lot on the court. He was steadfastly, he was someone who was staunchly liberal, saying the need for equitable and just treatment of the country's minorities by states and federal governments. He was considered a very reasonable court activist who was committed to making the U.S. Constitution actually work for everyone, not just certain people. He would really impact things on the court, setting up the idea of what they say is a sliding scale of the Equal Protection Clause that would weigh the objectives of the government against the nature and interests of the groups affected by the law. While this was never adopted fully by the Supreme Court, several major cases, civil rights cases in the 70s, echoed Marshall's views. He was also rigidly against the idea of capital punishment and preferred the rights of a national government over the rights of states. So yeah, we can push all the way back to the idea of John Marshall, because he sets a lot of precedents and helps set up that the states do have, the national government does have jurisdiction over the state governments in most things. Thurgood Marshall would serve on the Supreme Court as it went through a period of heavy ideological change. In his first few years on the bench, he fit very comfortably among a liberal majority under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren. However, as time went on, those allies would slowly retire or die in office, setting up chances for Republican presidents to swing the pendulum of activism in a conservative direction. By the time of his retirement in 1991, he was known as the Great Dissenter. So at first, a lot of his decisions went equally with most of the other court because they agreed pretty much on the whole on a just and liberal view of the Constitution in court cases. But as he went further into his career, he became known as the Great Dissenter because he was often one of the very last liberal members of a Supreme Court controlled by a conservative majority. But yeah, let's look at some of the other things he's been through. Oh yeah, he would die in 1993, January 24th, 1993, in Bethesda, Maryland. So yeah, appraisal and legacy. This is, I just read a lot from Britannica. Now this is from YouTube. According to scholar Daniel Moak, Thurgood Marshall profoundly shaped the political direction of the U.S., transformed constitutional law, and opened up new facets of citizenship to African Americans. For Tushnet, he was probably the most important American lawyer of the 20th century. In the view of the political scientist Robert C. Smith, he was one of the greatest leaders in the history of the African American struggle for freedom and equality. And a 1999 survey of black political scientists listed Thurgood Marshall as one of the 10 greatest African American leaders in history. Panelists described him as the greatest jurist of the 20th century and stated that he spearheaded the creation of the legal foundations of the civil rights movement. Scholars of the Supreme Court have not rated Marshall as highly as some of his colleagues, although his pre-Supreme Court legal career and staunch liberalism have met with broad approval. A perception that he lacked substantial influence over his fellow justices has harmed his reputation. But in Abraham's view, he was one of America's greatest public lawyers and was not a great, but he was not a great Supreme Court justice. 1993 survey of legal scholars finds that Marshall was ranked as the 17th greatest justice of the Supreme Court, a rating that, while still lower than that of his fellow liberal justices, was substantially higher than was recorded in an earlier survey. Marshall has received numerous tributes. State of Maryland renamed Baltimore's airport to the Baltimore-Washington International Thurgood Marshall Airport in 2005. And the University of Maryland's library, remember, he was rejected from the University of Maryland, is named in his honor. Buildings named for Thurgood Marshall include New York's Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse, renamed in 2001, where he heard cases as an appellate judge, and the Federal Judicial Center in Washington. His name graces streets and schools all over the nation. Thurgood Marshall posthumously received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Bill Clinton in 1993, and the U.S. Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp in his honor in 2003. He was depicted by Sidney Poitier in the 1991 television movie Separate but Equal by Lawrence Fishburne in George Stephen Jr.'s Broadway play Thurgood, and by Chadwick Boseman in the 2017 film Marshall. So yeah, Thurgood Marshall, very important if you want to talk about, civil rights and everything. He was just as important as many of the other more well-known figures of that era, both serving as a lawyer and as a Supreme Court justice. Now, this will be the end of this episode. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting links in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.